A girl rescues a millionaire during a fire. Days later, he was shocked to see police cars at his house. The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden light, reflecting off the swings and slides where children laughed and played. Among them, a 9-year-old girl named Sophie stood out. Her brown hair tied in a messy braid, her floral dress fluttering in the wind as she ran from one playground to another. She was the embodiment of childhood joy, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. As Sophie prepared for another slide down the playground, something caught her attention. An unusual smell hung in the air, different from the usual scent of freshly cut grass and cotton candy. She wrinkled her nose, her eyes scanning the horizon until they fixed on an imposing glass and steel building rising near the park. "Smoke," she whispered, her heart racing as she saw grey clouds escaping from the upper windows of the building. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air, rising above the happy chatter of the park. Sophie froze, her eyes wide as she stared at the building. More screams followed, and now she could see people running out of the building in panic. "Fire! Call the fire department!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted in the park. Parents grabbed their children, running away from the danger. Adults pulled out their cell phones, frantically calling emergency services. But Sophie remained still, her gaze fixed on the upper windows of the building, where flames were beginning to lick the sky. "Sophie, come here right now." A woman, probably one of the park's caretakers, shouted, but something inside Sophie compelled her to act. Without a second thought, she jumped off the slide and ran towards the burning building. "Sophie, no, come back here." The shouts echoed behind her, but Sophie didn't look back. As she approached the entrance of the building, the heat was intense, and the smoke began to obscure her vision. Sophie hesitated for a moment, fear finally catching up to her. But then, another cry for help echoed from inside the building, and she knew she couldn't turn back. With a courage that would surprise even adults, Sophie entered the smoke-filled lobby. The luxurious lobby, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, was unrecognizable under the thick smoke. Sophie coughed, her eyes stinging as she tried to see through the grey haze. "Is anyone there?" she called out, her small voice almost swallowed by the crackling of the flames. A faint groan came from a corner of the lobby. Sophie moved towards the sound, stumbling over fallen debris. That's when she saw him, a man with greying hair, trapped under a heavy reception desk that had fallen. "Don't worry, sir." "I'll help you," Sophie shouted, rushing to the man's side. The man, Thomas, looked at her with wide eyes filled with surprise and confusion. "Little girl, you need to get out of here. It's dangerous." But Sophie was already pushing the desk with all the strength her small body could muster. To her surprise, the adrenaline gave her extra strength, and she managed to move the furniture just enough for Thomas to crawl out. "Come on, sir, we need to get out of here," Sophie shouted, pulling Thomas by the arm. Together, they stumbled towards the exit, Sophie leading the way through the increasingly dense smoke. The heat was almost unbearable, and Sophie could hear the building groaning and cracking around them. When they finally emerged into the fresh air outside, they were greeted by shouts of relief and astonishment. They had barely taken a few steps when a deafening roar echoed behind them. Sophie turned just in time to see part of the building collapse, exactly where they had been moments before. Sirens cut through the air, and fire trucks appeared around the corner. Paramedics rushed towards them, wrapping Sophie and Thomas in blankets and checking their injuries. A firefighter approached, his face a mix of admiration and concern. "Are you the girl who went into the building?" he asked, incredulous. Sophie nodded shyly, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she had done. "That was incredibly brave and dangerous," the firefighter said, his voice softening. "You saved this man's life." Thomas, still coughing but now more lucid, looked at Sophie with tear-filled eyes. "You're my guardian angel," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What's your name, my little heroine?" "Sophie," she replied, a small smile forming on her soot-covered face. As the paramedics took them to the ambulance, Sophie couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and excitement. She knew she would be in trouble with her parents, but something told her that her life had changed forever that day. What she didn't know was how much this change would affect not only her life, but also the life of the man she had just saved. The chaotic rescue scene gave way to the frantic atmosphere of the emergency room. Thomas, still dazed by the recent events, was quickly taken for examinations, while he insisted with the doctors and nurses, "The girl. Where is the girl who saved me?" His voice was barely audible over the hospital's bustle, but the nurse gently reassured him, promising to get information about his young savior. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, a different scene unfolded. Anne and Pierre, Sophie's parents, arrived out of breath, their faces a mix of worry and relief. They spotted their daughter sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in an orange blanket and being examined by a paramedic. "Sophie!" Anne cried, running towards her daughter with Pierre close behind. Sophie looked up, a shy smile forming on her soot-covered face. "Mom, Dad!" Anne embraced Sophie tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Never scare us like that again. You could have gotten seriously hurt." Pierre knelt beside them, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "What were you thinking, ma petite?" Going into a burning building, Sophie looked at her parents, her eyes shining with a mix of regret and determination. "I heard someone calling for help. Dad, I couldn't just stand there." The paramedic gently interrupted, explaining that Sophie needed to go to the hospital for a full evaluation, just to be safe. As the family prepared to get into the ambulance, they were approached by a local reporter, microphone in hand and camera rolling. "Excuse me, are you the parents of the hero girl?" the reporter asked, her face lit up with the prospect of an emotional story. Anne and Pierre exchanged worried glances, but before they could respond, Sophie spoke up. "I just did what anyone would do. The man needed help." The simplicity and purity of Sophie's response immediately captured the reporter's heart and everyone around. Within minutes, the story of the heroic rescue by a 9-year-old began to spread like wildfire. Inside the hospital, Thomas was taken to a private room after initial examinations. Lying on the bed, with an oxygen mask over his face, he found himself immersed in memories of his past. Flashback. Thomas, at 25, sitting in a small makeshift office, working tirelessly on his first big deal. The late nights, the cold coffee, it all seemed worth it when he finally closed the contract that would launch his career. Years passed in a blur of meetings, business trips, and financial successes. Thomas saw his empire grow, but something always seemed to be missing. In every gala party, in every inauguration of a new venture, he found himself surrounded by people, yet deeply alone. One memory in particular haunted him, his 50th birthday, a lavish party at his penthouse, dozens of friends and business colleagues present, but no truly close face. That night, looking out at the city from the height of his empire, Thomas felt the crushing weight of his loneliness. End of flashback. Thomas was brought back to the present by the sound of soft knocks on the room door. A nurse entered, smiling gently. "Mr. Thomas, how are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," he replied, his voice still hoarse. "Did you get any information about the girl?" The nurse nodded. "Yes, her name is Sophie. She's also in the hospital for examinations, but she's fine. Her parents are with her." Thomas adjusted himself on the bed, a sudden urgency in his voice. "I need to see her. Can you arrange that?" The nurse hesitated. "Mr. Thomas, you need to rest." "Maybe tomorrow." "No," Thomas interrupted, his voice firm despite his weakness. "This girl risked her life for me, a complete stranger. I need to thank her personally. Please." Something in the intensity of Thomas's gaze made the nurse give in. "I'll see what I can do," she promised, leaving the room. Meanwhile, Sophie and her parents were in another wing of the hospital. Sophie had undergone examinations and, fortunately, had no serious injuries besides some scratches and mild smoke inhalation. Anne held Sophie's hand, still trying to process the day's events. "Ma chérie, we are very proud of you, but also very scared. Do you understand the danger you put yourself in?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "I know, Mum, but I couldn't leave that man in there. He needed help." Pierre, sitting on the other side of the bed, smiled softly. "You have a brave heart, Sophie. But next time, leave the rescues to the firefighters, d'accord?" Before Sophie could respond, the door to the room opened and the nurse entered. "Excuse me," she said, smiling at the family. The man Sophie saved, Mr. Thomas, is asking to see her. He would really like to thank her personally. Would that be possible? Anne and Pierre exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and hesitation in their faces. Sophie, however, lit up immediately. "Can we, Mum, please?" she begged, her eyes shining with expectation. After a moment of silence, Anne nodded slowly. "All right, but just for a few minutes, you need to rest." The nurse smiled, relieved. "Great. I'll take you to his room." As they followed the nurse through the hospital corridors, Sophie felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. She didn't know, but this meeting would mark the beginning of an unlikely friendship that would change her life and Thomas's forever. As they approached the room, Sophie's heart beat faster. The door opened, and she took a hesitant step inside, ready to face the consequences of her heroic act. The afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden light, creating long shadows that danced among the trees and playgrounds. Children ran and laughed, their joyful voices echoing through the air. Amidst this familiar scene, an unusual figure stood out. Thomas, the recently recovered millionaire, walking slowly along the gravel paths, his eyes scanning the park with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. Dressed in a casual suit that contrasted with the relaxed atmosphere, Thomas looked somewhat out of place. His face, still marked by recent events, bore an expression of determination. He had waited weeks for this moment, recovering in the hospital and then at home, impatient to personally thank the girl who had saved his life. On the other side of the park, Sophie swung happily, her brown hair fluttering in the wind. Her parents, Anne and Pierre, sat on a nearby bench, watching her with a mix of pride and concern that hadn't left them since the day of the fire. It was Anne who first noticed Thomas's presence. "Pierre," she whispered, nudging her husband, "isn't that the man Sophie saved?" Pierre followed his wife's gaze and nodded, surprised. "It is him. What do you think he's doing here?" While this was happening, Sophie, absorbed in her play, hadn't noticed the newcomer. It was only when she jumped off the swing in mid-flight, landing with the grace of a miniature gymnast, that her eyes met Thomas's. For a moment, they both froze, as if time had stopped. Then, a wide smile spread across Sophie's face. "Mr. Thomas," she cried, running towards him with the enthusiasm characteristic of a 9-year-old. Thomas felt a lump in his throat, deeply moved by the girl's warm reaction. When Sophie stopped in front of him, breathless and smiling, he knelt to be at her eye level. "Hello, Sophie," he said, his voice soft and filled with gratitude. "It's really good to see you again. Are you feeling better?" Sophie asked, her big eyes filled with genuine concern. Thomas smiled, touched by the girl's sincerity. "Yes, thanks to you. In fact, I came here especially to thank you." At that moment, Anne and Pierre approached, their expressions a mix of caution and curiosity. "Mr. Thomas," Pierre greeted, extending his hand. "What a surprise to see you here." Thomas stood up, shaking Pierre's hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Dubois, right? I apologize for showing up like this unannounced. I needed to thank Sophie personally for what she did." Anne smiled gently, placing a protective hand on Sophie's shoulder. "There's no need to thank us." Sophie acted on instinct, although she gave Sophie a meaningful look. She gave us quite a scare. Sophie looked down, a bit embarrassed, but Thomas quickly intervened. "On the contrary, there's every need," he insisted. "Sophie didn't just save my life, she made me rethink many things." He turned to Sophie. "Sophie, what you did was extraordinary. You're a true hero." Sophie's cheeks flushed with the compliment. "I just did what I thought was right," she murmured. Thomas smiled, charmed by the girl's modesty. He then turned to Anne and Pierre. "And I would like to offer a reward for Sophie's bravery. Anything you want, a scholarship, a new house, a vacation?" Pierre raised a hand, gently interrupting Thomas. "Mr. Thomas, we appreciate your generosity, but we can't accept—" Sophie didn't do what she did expecting a reward. Anne agreed. "Besides, having you here, healthy and grateful, is reward enough." Thomas was momentarily speechless, touched by the family's integrity. It was Sophie who broke the silence. "Mr. Thomas," she said, tugging lightly on his suit jacket, "would you like to play on the slide with me?" The innocent question caught everyone off guard. Thomas looked at the slide, then at his suit, and then back at Sophie's hopeful face. For a moment he seemed about to refuse, but then something in his eyes changed. "You know what? I'd love to," he replied, to Sophie's delight and her parents' amused surprise. What followed was a surreal and charming scene, the powerful millionaire, still in his suit, sliding down the slide next to a beaming Sophie. Their laughter echoed through the park, drawing curious and smiling glances from other visitors. As Thomas and Sophie played, Anne and Pierre watched, their initial concerns giving way to a warm acceptance of the joy evident in their daughter. The afternoon wore on, and the sun began to set when a new figure appeared in the park. A tall, thin man in an impeccable suit and carrying a leather briefcase approached with quick, determined steps. "Thomas," he called, his voice tense and urgent. "I finally found you. We have a situation at the company that needs your immediate attention." Thomas, who was helping Sophie climb a jungle gym, turned surprised. "Paul, what are you doing here?" Paul, the newcomer, gave Sophie a quick, confused glance before turning back to Thomas. "Sorry to interrupt, but it's urgent. The board is in panic over the latest developments of the Omega project." Thomas, hesitant, looked at Sophie, who watched the scene with curiosity. "Sophie, I'm sorry, but I have to go," he said, his voice filled with genuine regret. "Adult stuff, you know how it is." Sophie nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "It's okay, Mr. Thomas. Thank you for playing with me." Thomas smiled back, then an idea seemed to occur to him. He knelt down again, getting to Sophie's eye level. "Hey, how about this? I promise to come back here to talk more. Maybe next time we can play chess. I heard you're really good." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Really? How you promise?" "I promise," Thomas replied solemnly, extending his pinky finger. "Scout's honor." Sophie hooked her pinky with his, sealing the promise with a laugh. Thomas stood up, said his goodbyes to Anne and Pierre, and then followed Paul out of the park. As he walked away, he couldn't help but look back, seeing Sophie waving enthusiastically. In that moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of lightness, of renewed purpose. He didn't know it yet, but that afternoon in the park would mark the beginning of a profound change in his life. All thanks to a brave 9-year-old girl who had done much more than save him from a fire. She had rekindled a long-forgotten spark in his heart. The following weeks brought a notable change in the park's routine. Thomas, the once distant millionaire, became a regular presence, his tall, well-dressed figure contrasting with the relaxed atmosphere of the playground. He would arrive at the same time every day, just before sunset, with a chessboard under his arm and a smile of anticipation on his face. Sophie, for her part, eagerly awaited these visits. Her eyes would light up with excitement every time she saw Thomas entering the park. For her, these afternoons became an adventure, an opportunity to explore a whole new world through the stories and experiences of her new friend. One of these afternoons, as they played chess on a park bench, Sophie surprised Thomas with an unexpected question. "Mr. Thomas, why do adults always seem so serious?" Thomas, about to move his knight, paused, reflecting on the question. "Well, Sophie, I think it's because we have many responsibilities." Sophie frowned, moving her rook. "Why but can't responsibilities be fun?" The innocent question made Thomas laugh, but it also made him think, "You know, Sophie, you might be right. Maybe we adults have forgotten how to make things fun." On another occasion, as they watched the clouds, Sophie pointed to a particularly intriguing formation. "Look, Mr. Thomas, that cloud looks like a dragon doing ballet." Thomas squinted, trying to see what Sophie saw. All he could make out was a shapeless mass of water vapor. But Sophie's enthusiasm was contagious, and soon he found himself imagining not just a dancing dragon, but an entire company of mythical creatures in the skies. These simple yet profound interactions began to change Thomas in subtle but significant ways. He smiled more, laughed louder, and for the first time in years felt truly present in the moment. Anne and Pierre, Sophie's parents, watched this developing friendship with a mix of caution and fascination. Initially, they were apprehensive about their daughter spending so much time with a stranger, especially someone as powerful and influential as Thomas. One night, After Sophie had gone to bed, the couple discussed the situation. "I don't know, Pierre," Anne sighed, stirring her tea absently. "It's a bit strange, isn't it? A man his age spending so much time with a child." Pierre nodded, understanding his wife's concerns. "I get it, ma chérie, but have you seen how happy Sophie is? How she's more confident, more curious about the world?" Anne couldn't deny it. In the past weeks, Sophie had blossomed. Her performance at school had improved. She asked more questions, read more books. It was as if her friendship with Thomas had opened a door to a world of possibilities she had never imagined before. "Besides," Pierre continued, "Thomas has been nothing but respectful. He always consults us before planning any activity with Sophie, and he never crosses the boundaries we've set." Anne smiled, relaxing a bit. "You're right. Maybe we're witnessing something truly special here." While Sophie and Thomas's friendship flourished, not everyone was happy with the situation. Paul, Thomas's right-hand man at the company, watched the frequent park visits with growing irritation. "Thomas, we have a meeting with the investors tomorrow," Paul insisted one afternoon, intercepting Thomas as he left the office. "We need to review the numbers again." Thomas, already holding the chessboard, smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, Paul, but I promised Sophie I'd play with her today. Can we review the numbers in the morning?" Paul could barely hide his frustration. "In the morning, Thomas. You realize how much is at stake here. We can't risk losing millions over a child." Thomas's expression hardened slightly. "Paul, I understand your concern, but I trust you to handle this. Sophie is important to me, and keeping my promises to her is a priority." Leaving a stunned Paul behind, Thomas headed out, eager for another afternoon in the park. As the days went by, Thomas began to see the park and its surroundings with new eyes. Through Sophie's keen observations, he noticed things he had previously overlooked. The swing that needed repair, the lack of ramps for wheelchair access, the scarcity of shaded areas for hot days. It was during one of these afternoons, as Sophie excitedly talked about a school project to plant trees, that an idea began to form in Thomas's mind. "Sophie," he interrupted gently, "what would you think if we could improve this park? Make it an even more special place for all the children?" Sophie's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? Could we do that?" Thomas smiled, already imagining the possibilities. "Well, I have some resources I can use to help. What do you think the park needs?" What followed was an explosion of ideas from Sophie. More trees, a new accessible playground, a small outdoor library, even a little stage for performances. Inspired by Sophie's enthusiasm, Thomas made a decision right then and there. He would make a substantial donation to renovate the park, transforming it into a truly inclusive and educational space for the entire community. That night, as Sophie shared her plans excitedly with her parents, Thomas made some important calls. He contacted the city council, architects and urban planners, setting in motion a project that would not only transform the park, but also his own life. Lying in his bed that night, Thomas reflected on the changes of the past weeks. He felt more alive, more connected to the world around him than he ever had. All thanks to a little girl who had not only saved his life, but given him a new purpose. With a smile on his face, Thomas fell asleep, eager for the next day and all the new adventures his unlikely friendship with Sophie would bring. He didn't know it yet, but this decision to renovate the park would be just the beginning of a journey that would change not only his life, but the lives of an entire community. The sound of machinery and the bustle of workers filled the air in the park, which now looked more like a construction site. The renovation project was in full swing, transforming the space day by day. Safety fences delineated areas under construction, while new structures began to take shape. Thomas was at the center of it all, personally overseeing the progress. His usual suit had been replaced by more casual clothes and a safety helmet, a change that reflected his new hands-on approach. Sophie, of course, was always nearby, her eyes shining with excitement at each new addition to the park. She would dart from one place to another, bombarding Thomas and the workers with enthusiastic questions. "Mr. Thomas, is it true we're going to have an interactive fountain over there?" she asked, pointing to an area under construction. Thomas smiled, charmed by the girl's enthusiasm. "Yes, Sophie. And it's not just any fountain. It will have colored lights and water jets that the children can control." A shout of joy escaped Sophie, who immediately began planning all the games she would play in the new fountain. The news of the park's renovation spread quickly through the community, generating a wave of optimism and gratitude. Entire families would come daily to see the progress, and Thomas often found himself surrounded by grateful residents. One afternoon, as Thomas explained the plans for the new picnic area to a group of parents, his phone vibrated insistently in his pocket. He ignored it, focused on sharing his vision for the community space. However, the joy and enthusiasm in the park contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere in Thomas's company offices. Paul, in particular, was becoming increasingly frustrated with his boss's frequent absences. "Sir, we have a crucial meeting with the shareholders in half an hour," Paul said in an urgent tone when he finally managed to reach Thomas on the phone. Thomas Yeast, who was helping Sophie plant a tree in the park's new community garden, hesitated. "Paul, can't you handle this? I'm in the middle of something important here." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Paul spoke again, his voice was tense with contained frustration. "Thomas, with all due respect, your presence is essential. The shareholders are worried about the company's direction. We need to reassure them." Thomas sighed, looking at Sophie, who smiled proudly at the small sapling they had just planted. "All right, Paul. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Putting down the phone, Thomas turned to Sophie with an apologetic smile. "Sophie, dear, I have to go. Adult stuff, you understand?" Sophie nodded, a shadow of disappointment crossing her face. "Okay, Mr. Thomas. Will you come back tomorrow?" "Of course I will," Thomas promised, ruffling the girl's hair affectionately before leaving. At the meeting, Thomas faced a group of disgruntled shareholders. The questions were tough, the expressions skeptical. "Mr. Thomas, we're concerned about your recent distraction," one of the older shareholders commented. "This park project seems to be taking up too much of your time." Thomas sat up straight in his chair, his voice firm when he replied, "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, this project is not a distraction, but an investment in the future. We're building goodwill in the community, improving our public image. This will only bring benefits to our company in the long run." Despite his confident words, Thomas couldn't help but notice the skeptical glances exchanged among the shareholders. Paul, in particular, seemed especially tense, his hands nervously gripping a folder of documents. In the following days, the tension between Thomas and Paul became increasingly palpable. Sophie, in her childlike innocence, began to notice the worried expressions on Thomas's face whenever his phone rang, or the way he would frown as he read messages. One afternoon, as they played chess, Sophie finally asked, "Mr. Thomas, are you sad about something?" Thomas, surprised by the girl's perceptiveness, tried to smile. "No, Sophie. Just have a lot on my mind. Adult work stuff, you know?" Sophie nodded, although it was clear she didn't fully understand. "The man in the suit who always calls you, is he your friend?" Thomas hesitated, wondering how to explain his complicated relationship with Paul to a 9-year-old. "Well, he works with me. Sometimes work friends can disagree about things." Before Sophie could ask more questions, Thomas's phone rang again. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed instantly, a mix of surprise and concern taking over his face. "I'm sorry, Sophie, I need to take this," he said, standing up and stepping a few paces away. Sophie watched as Thomas spoke on the phone, his voice low and urgent. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he ran his hand through his hair repeatedly. When Thomas returned, his face was pale and his eyes distant. "Sophie, I have to go. Something important has come up. Is everything okay, Mr. Thomas?" Sophie asked, her voice filled with concern. Thomas forced a smile, but he couldn't completely hide his perturbation. "It will be fine. Don't worry. See you tomorrow, okay?" As Thomas hurried away, Sophie watched him with a mix of confusion and concern. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew something had changed. The man walking away seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders, so different from the happy, relaxed Thomas she had come to know in the past weeks. That night, Lying in her bed, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Thomas and the mysterious phone call. She had a feeling that something important was happening, something that could change everything. With these troubling thoughts, she fell asleep, not knowing that the events of the next days would test not only her friendship with Thomas, but also the strength and courage she didn't even know she possessed. The morning began like any other for Thomas. He woke up early, prepared his coffee as usual, and sat on his spacious balcony, appreciating the view of his meticulously cared-for garden. The newspaper of the day lay open in front of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere, in the park, and the plans he had made with Sophie for that afternoon. A soft smile played on his lips as he imagined the girl's excitement at seeing the progress of the new reading area. It was in this moment of quiet contemplation that the sound of approaching engines broke the morning silence. Thomas frowned, putting his coffee cup down on the table. The noise grew louder, and soon he could see 2 police cars entering his property, their lights flashing silently. His heart raced, a feeling of apprehension settling in his chest. Standing up slowly, Thomas walked to the entrance of his mansion, reaching the front door just as the police officers stepped out of their vehicles. There were 4 of them, their faces serious and determined. "Mr. Thomas," the officer who seemed to be in charge asked, approaching him. Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you?" The officer took a deep breath before speaking, his tone grave and formal. "Mr. Thomas, I'm Detective Moreau. We're here to inform you that the investigations into the Central Building fire have been concluded. The incident has been classified as a criminal act." Thomas blinked, confused. "Criminal? But how?" "Forensic evidence indicates the use of accelerants at multiple points of origin of the fire," the detective continued. "Mr. Thomas, I'm sorry to inform you, but you are one of the main suspects in this case." The words hit Thomas like a punch in the stomach. He staggered slightly, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. "Suspect? Me? But I almost died in that fire." Detective Moreau maintained his neutral expression. "We understand your surprise, sir. However, we have reasons to believe that you may have had motives to start the fire. We need you to come to the station for a formal interrogation." Thomas felt as if the world was spinning around him. His mind raced, trying to process the absurd accusation being made against him. "This is ridiculous. I could have died." The detective's expression remained impassive. "Do I understand your shock, sir? Nevertheless, we have evidence that suggests your involvement. Please come with us to the station." Thomas felt a wave of panic rising within him. He looked around, his eyes searching for something, anything that could help him make sense of this surreal situation. That's when he saw a familiar car speeding onto his property. Paul jumped out of the vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop, his face a mask of concern. "Thomas!" he called, running towards the entrance. "I came as soon as I heard what's happening." Detective Moreau turned to Paul, his gaze sharp. "And you are?" "Paul Durand. I'm the vice president of Mr. Thomas's company," Paul replied quickly, positioning himself beside Thomas in a show of support. "Can someone please tell me why there are police officers on my boss's property?" Thomas, still dazed, could barely explain the situation to Paul. As he listened, Paul's face turned red with indignation. "This is an outrage," Paul exclaimed. "Thomas is a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. He would never do something like this." Detective Moreau remained unmoved by Paul's protest. "Sir, I understand your concern, but we have a procedure to follow. Mr. Thomas, please come with us now." At that moment, a familiar car drove slowly past the mansion. Thomas recognized the vehicle of Sophie's parents immediately. His heart sank as he saw the girl's shocked face pressed against the car window, her eyes wide with concern and confusion. Sophie couldn't understand what was happening, but the sight of her friend surrounded by police filled her with fear. "Dad, stop the car!" she cried, but Pierre, equally shocked, only slowed down, not wanting to get involved in what seemed like a serious situation. Thomas made eye contact with Sophie for a brief moment, and the look of pure desperation and confusion on the girl's face hit him like a stab in the heart. He wanted to shout, to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but the words stuck in his throat. "Mr. Thomas," Detective Moreau's firm voice brought him back to reality. "We need to go now." With a final, desperate look at Paul, Thomas nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come with you." But this is a terrible mistake. As the police officers escorted Thomas to the car, Paul shouted, "Don't worry, Thomas. I'll call our lawyers immediately. We'll sort this out." Thomas barely heard Paul's words. His eyes were fixed on the Dubois car, which was now slowly driving away. He could see Sophie squirming in the back seat, trying to maintain eye contact with him for as long as possible. When the police car door closed, Thomas felt as if a part of his life was being ripped away from him. The past weeks of joy and purpose he had experienced with Sophie and the park project seemed now like a distant dream, rapidly fading away in the face of this terrifying new reality. The police car drove away from the property, taking Thomas to an uncertain future. In the back seat, he struggled against the rising panic. How could this be happening? How could he prove his innocence? And what would Sophie think of him now? Meanwhile, in the Dubois car, Sophie was inconsolable. "Mom, Dad, we have to help Mr. Thomas," she sobbed. "He didn't do anything wrong." Anne turned in the passenger seat, trying to calm her daughter. "Sophie, ma chérie, we don't know what's happening. We have to trust that the police are doing their job." But Sophie couldn't accept that. In her mind, Thomas was a hero, someone doing wonderful things for the community. How could someone like that be a suspect in a crime? Pierre, driving in silence, exchanged a worried glance with Anne. They had trusted Thomas, allowed him to become an important part of their daughter's life. Now they faced the frightening possibility of having made a terrible mistake in judgment. The day that had begun with so much promise had turned into a nightmare for everyone involved. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a bright light over the city, shadows of doubt and fear stretched over the lives of Thomas, Sophie, and all those around them. The future, once so bright and full of possibilities, now seemed uncertain and threatening. The interrogation room was cold and impersonal, its grey walls seeming to close in on Thomas as he sat, uncomfortable, in the metal chair. Detective Moreau entered, carrying a thick folder, his face a mask of professionalism. "Mr. Thomas," he began, sitting down across the table from him, "let's start from the beginning. Where were you on the night of the fire?" Thomas took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I was in the building, working late in my office. That's when I noticed the smoke and tried to get out." Moreau nodded, making notes. "And why were you working so late?" "We were in the middle of an important negotiation. I wanted to review some documents before the next day's meeting," Thomas explained, his voice betraying a slight tremor. The interrogation continued for hours. Questions about his finances, about the company's situation, about possible enemies. Thomas answered as best he could, but with each question he felt more cornered. "Mr. Thomas Knauf," Detective Moreau said, leaning forward, "were you aware that your company was in financial trouble?" Thomas hesitated. "We had some challenges, like any business team, but—" "Challenges," Moreau interrupted. "Our records show you were on the brink of bankruptcy." "A convenient fire. With good insurance. Could solve a lot of problems, couldn't it?" Thomas paled. "That's absurd. I would never—" At that moment, the door opened and another detective entered, whispering something in Moreau's ear. The detective nodded, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "Mr. Thomas, we have just interrogated your vice president, Paul Durand. He has provided us with some very interesting information." Across the hallway, in another interrogation room, Paul sat uncomfortably in his chair. He had come voluntarily to give his statement, determined to help Thomas. But the investigator's questions had caught him off guard. "Mr. Durand, can you confirm that the company was facing serious financial difficulties?" the detective asked. Paul hesitated. "Well, yes, we had some problems, but—" "And Mr. Thomas was aware of this. Of course, he's the CEO, but Thomas would never do anything illegal," Paul insisted. The detective leaned forward. "Mr. Durand, sir, we have records of several emergency meetings in the weeks leading up to the fire. What was discussed in those meetings?" Paul felt sweat trickling down his back. He wanted to protect Thomas, but he also couldn't lie to the police. We discussed options to save the company. What kind of options? Paul closed his eyes, knowing his next words could be crucial. Selling some assets, looking for new investors, and the possibility of selling the central building. The detective smiled, as if she had just heard exactly what she expected, including the central building. Paul nodded slowly, realizing too late how that could sound. Meanwhile, back in the Dubois house, a heated discussion was taking place. Sophie had locked herself in her room, refusing to come out or talk to anyone. "Pierre, what are we going to tell her?" Anne asked, her voice filled with concern. "Sophie trusts Thomas so much. This will devastate her." Pierre ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I don't know, Anne. Part of me wants to protect her, keep this away from her. But she saw what happened. We can't just pretend nothing is wrong." "But what if it's all a misunderstanding?" Anne argued. "What if Thomas is innocent? We don't want Sophie to lose faith in people." Pierre sighed deeply. Maybe we can tell her a simplified version. Say that Thomas is helping the police with an investigation. Hey, it's not a lie, counts, but it's not the whole truth either." Anne nodded slowly. Yes, that could work, for now at least. Upstairs, Sophie lay on her bed, hugging a teddy bear, silent tears streaming down her face. She didn't understand what was happening. Why would the police take Thomas away? He was good, kind, he was helping improve the park. None of it made sense. She got up, walking to the window. The park was visible in the distance, the construction work still in progress. Sophie thought about all the afternoons she had spent there with Thomas, playing chess, talking about their dreams. How could someone like that be a criminal? Suddenly, an idea occurred to her. What if Thomas was in danger? What if someone was trying to hurt him? Sophie knew the adults wouldn't take her seriously, but she was determined to find out the truth and help her friend. Back at the police station, Detective Moreau was ready for the final blow. He opened the folder he had brought, spreading photos and documents on the table in front of Thomas. "Mr. Thomas, our investigations have revealed something very interesting," Moreau began, his voice filled with triumph. 2 weeks before the fire, the insurance value of the central building was significantly increased. Coincidence? Thomas looked at the documents, his face a mask of shock and confusion. I didn't know about that. There must be some mistake." Moreau shook his head. "There's no mistake, Mr. Thomas. We have forensic evidence showing that the fire was deliberately started in several points of the building, and now we have a clear motive, insurance fraud to save your failing company." Thomas felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. How could this be happening? He looked at the documents, at the photos of the burning building, at the detective's implacable face. At that moment, Thomas realized he was facing the battle of his life, not only to prove his innocence, but to save everything he had built, including his new friendship with Sophie. With a trembling but determined voice, Thomas looked directly into the detective's eyes. "I am innocent," he declared, "and I will prove it, no matter what it takes." The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city. In different corners of this same city, Thomas, Paul, Sophie and her parents faced a night of doubts, fears, and determination. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. Thomas's office, once a sanctuary of productivity and success, now felt like a fortress under siege. Piles of documents covered every available surface, while Thomas himself, with dark circles under his eyes and stubble on his chin, paced back and forth, mentally reviewing the events of the past months. "Saw the increase in insurance," he murmured to himself. "That was Paul's idea. He said it was a necessary precaution." Thomas paused, frowning. "But why didn't I question it more? Why didn't I see the signs?" His soliloquy was interrupted by the harsh ring of the telephone. It was his lawyer, with more disheartening news. "Thomas, the media is in a frenzy." The lawyer's tired voice came through the line. "The speculations are getting out of control. We need to make an official statement soon." Thomas sighed heavily. "What are they saying now?" "Everything. From conspiracy theories about you planning the fire, to claim insurance, to rumors of you trying to cover up shady business deals by destroying evidence. It's a madhouse out there." Hanging up the phone, Thomas turned on the television in his office, only to be bombarded with images of himself and sensational headlines. Tycoon or criminal mastermind? The fire that shook the city. Who is the real Thomas? From hero to villain. The fall of an empire. Turning off the TV with frustration, Thomas wondered how his life had turned into this nightmare in such a short time. Meanwhile, at the Dubois house, Sophie was fighting her own battle. "Please, Mom, we need to visit Mr. Thomas. He needs us now." Anne looked at her daughter with a mix of admiration and concern. "Sophie, dear, I understand you're worried about him, but the situation is complicated." "But he's our friend," Sophie insisted, her eyes shining with determination. "Thai friends stick together in tough times, don't they?" Pierre, who had been listening to the conversation, couldn't help but smile at his daughter's unyielding logic. "She has a point, Anne," he said softly. Anne hesitated, torn between the desire to protect her daughter and the wish to do what felt right. Finally, she gave in. "All right, we can visit him. But it will be a short visit, understood?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, her face lighting up with a smile. At the company, Paul was walking through the corridors with a newfound confidence. He had called an emergency meeting with the main shareholders and executives. "Gentlemen," Paul began, his voice firm and authoritative, "I understand you're all concerned about the current situation, but I want to assure you that I'm taking all necessary measures to protect the company's interests during this turbulent period." One of the shareholders raised his hand. "And what about Thomas? Is he still in charge?" Paul hesitated for a moment before answering. "Thomas is focused on resolving his legal issues at the moment. To ensure the company's stability, I have temporarily taken over some of his responsibilities. It's for the best for all of us right now." The murmurs of approval that followed brought a subtle smile to Paul's lips. Back at Thomas's mansion, the atmosphere was one of desolation. Thomas sat in his favorite armchair staring into nothing, when the sound of the doorbell pulled him out of his somber thoughts. Dragging himself to the door, he opened it, only to be surprised by a small projectile launching itself into his arms. "Mr. Thomas," Sophie cried, hugging him tightly. For a moment, Thomas was frozen in surprise. Then, slowly, he returned the hug, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" Anne and Pierre stood a bit back, their faces a mix of apprehension and sympathy. "She insisted on coming to see you," Anne explained softly. "I hope we're not imposing." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "No, of course not. Please, come in." As the adults settled in the living room, exchanging awkward and tense conversations, Sophie pulled Thomas to a corner. "Mr. Thomas," she whispered, her big eyes serious, "I know you didn't do anything wrong. We'll prove it together, okay?" The simplicity and conviction in Sophie's words hit Thomas like a ray of light in the midst of darkness. For the first time in days, he felt a genuine smile form on his face. "Thank you, Sophie," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Your friendship means so much to me." For a few precious moments, as Sophie chattered about her ideas to help, and Thomas listened with attention, the weight of the accusations, the pressure of the media, and the worries about the future seemed to dissipate. In that small instance of connection, there was only the purity of a true friendship. Anne and Pierre watched the interaction with a mix of emotions. Seeing the effect Sophie had on Thomas, and the genuine affection between them, they began to question their own doubts. When it came time to leave, Sophie hugged Thomas one more time. "Stay strong, Mr. Thomas. Remember, the good guys always win in the end." As Thomas watched the Dubois family leave, he felt a renewal of spirit. Sophie's visit, though brief, had given him something he desperately needed: hope. Turning back to his office, Thomas looked at the piles of documents with a new determination. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore, but for Sophie, for the trust she had placed in him, and for all those who still believed in his innocence. "I will find the truth," he promised himself, no matter the cost. As the night fell over the city, the gears of destiny continued to turn. Thomas, reinvigorated by Sophie's surprise visit, dove back into his search for answers. Paul, in his new role as leader, wove plans that remained hidden in the shadows, and Sophie, determined in her belief in her friend's goodness, dreamed of the day when everything would be resolved. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the battle for the truth was far from over, and each of those involved would have a crucial role to play in the events to come. Detective Moreau's office was immersed in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers being shuffled. He and his team had spent the past weeks delving deeper into an investigation that was becoming increasingly complex, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in unexpected ways. "Chief," one of the investigators called out, looking up from a pile of documents. "I found something strange in Paul Durand's statements." Moreau approached, curious. "What do you have?" "Well, in his first deposition, Paul claimed he knew nothing about the increase in the building's insurance, but here," the investigator pointed to a document, "we have an email from him to the insurance company discussing exactly that 2 weeks before the fire." Moreau frowned, his mind working quickly. "That's interesting. It seems our Mr. Durand hasn't been entirely honest with us." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Sophie was walking hand in hand with her parents towards the police station. Anne and Pierre had decided it was time for Sophie to tell the police everything she knew about Thomas, hoping it could help clarify the situation. "Remember, dear," Anne said softly, "just tell the truth about what you saw and heard." Sophie nodded, determined to help her friend in any way she could. In the interrogation room, a female detective smiled at Sophie, trying to put her at ease. "So, Sophie, can you tell us about the times you and Mr. Thomas talked in the park?" Sophie took a deep breath and began to speak. She told about the chess games, the stories Thomas shared, and how he always talked about wanting to do the right thing. "One time," Sophie said, her eyes shining with the memory, "Mr. Thomas told me he was thinking about making big changes in his company. He said he wanted to be more like me, see the world with purer eyes." The detective exchanged a significant glance with Moreau, who was watching through the glass. These innocent words from Sophie seemed to cast a new light on Thomas's motivations. Meanwhile, in his mansion, Thomas was immersed in his own thoughts, reviewing mentally each decision he had made in the past months. Suddenly, something clicked in his mind. "Oh, my God," he murmured, standing up abruptly. "The changes I wanted to make, the transparency, the ethics, that must have scared someone." Thomas began to pace back and forth, his mind racing. He had talked to Sophie about wanting to make things right, be more honest in his business. But what if those changes threatened someone who benefited from the status quo? At that moment, as if summoned by his thoughts, Paul entered the room, his face a mask of concern. "Thomas, you need to rest," he said, noticing the dark circles under his boss's eyes. "Let the lawyers handle this." Thomas looked up from the documents. "Paul, do you remember that contract with Horizon Enterprises? Something about it never seemed right." Paul approached, a shadow of unease crossing his face. "That old deal." "Thomas, I don't think it's productive to go digging up the past right now. We need to focus on saving the company from this current scandal." Thomas hesitated, feeling the weight of Paul's words. Was he right? Should he let the past stay buried? Back at the police station, Anne and Pierre waited anxiously for Sophie's deposition to end. As the hours passed, they began to exchange worried glances. "Pierre," Anne whispered, "don't you think it's strange they're taking so long with Sophie? What could a child possibly know that's so important?" Pierre nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to think there's much more to this story than we imagined." Finally, Sophie emerged from the interrogation room, looking tired but proud. "I told them everything I knew, Mom. I think I helped Mr. Thomas." Anne hugged her daughter, exchanging another significant glance with Pierre. Both began to suspect that the recent events were much more complicated than they seemed at first glance. Detective Moreau approached the couple, his face serious but with a hint of hope. "Mr. and Mrs. Dubois, thank you for bringing Sophie today. Her information has been enlightening." As the Dubois family left the police station, a sudden commotion took over the place. An officer rushed towards Moreau, holding a plastic bag containing a cell phone. "Detective," the officer panted, "we found this near the fire site. It's a burner phone, but we managed to recover some data." Moreau took the bag, examining the device with interest. "And what do we have here?" the officer continued, his voice filled with excitement. "Emails, messages, everything points to the involvement of a company called Corporation X. It seems they've been planning to sabotage Thomas for months." Moreau's eyes widened with the revelation. He turned quickly to his team. "I want everything on this Corporation X on my desk in an hour. Records, contracts, any connection to Thomas or his company." As the team mobilized, Moreau couldn't help but feel they were on the brink of a major discovery. The case that had seemed so clear at the beginning, a desperate businessman setting fire to his own building for insurance money, was now revealing itself to be a web of corporate conspiracies and betrayals. Thomas, still in his mansion, received an unexpected call. It was his lawyer, his voice brimming with excitement. "Thomas, you won't believe what's happening. The police have found evidence that could clear your name, something about a rival company called Corporation X." As Thomas listened to the details, he felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that there was finally proof of his innocence, and anger at having been the target of such an elaborate conspiracy. As night fell over the city, the revelations of the day echoed through the halls of power. At Corporation X, nervous executives made frantic calls, trying to contain the damage. Paul, in his office, sweated cold, knowing his involvement was about to come to light. And in a small bedroom, Sophie fell asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of the day when her friend Thomas would finally be free of all accusations. She didn't know it yet, but her innocent testimony had been the key to unraveling a conspiracy far more complex than anyone could have imagined. The truth, as always, was stranger than fiction, and as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, it became clear that the story of Thomas, Sophie, and all those involved was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Detective Moreau stood in front of a board filled with photos, documents, and lines connecting different elements. The case that had begun as a simple fire investigation had turned into a complex web of corporate conspiracies that stretched far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. "All right, team," Moreau said to his gathered investigators, "let's recap what we have so far." One of the investigators stepped forward. "Corporation X seems to be at the center of all this. We've discovered a series of suspicious transactions between them and various shell companies. All these companies have some connection to Thomas's empire." Moreau nodded, his eyes scanning the connections on the board. "And Paul Durand? How does he fit into all this?" "It seems Paul was their man on the inside," another detective replied. "But we found records of several secret meetings between him and Corporation X executives in the past months. While the police unraveled the conspiracy, Thomas was in his office, receiving updates from his lawyer. Each new revelation left him more astounded. "You're telling me Robert, my golf partner for 15 years, was involved in this?" Thomas asked, incredulous. The lawyer nodded grimly. "Afraid so, yes. It seems Corporation X co-opted him some time ago. He was crucial in providing inside information on your operations." Thomas sank into his chair, feeling betrayed and exhausted. "And to think I trusted these people, thought of them as friends." At that moment, the phone rang. It was Detective Moreau. "Mr. Thomas, we need you to come to the station immediately. We have new developments you need to hear." In the interrogation room, Moreau presented Thomas with a series of documents and transcripts. "Mr. Thomas, your young friend Sophie provided us with a crucial piece of information without even realizing it." Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. "Sophie? How so?" Moreau smiled slightly. "She mentioned overhearing a strange conversation between Paul and an unknown man in the park a few weeks before the fire. Initially, we didn't give it much importance, but now..." He slid a photo across the table. It was a security image showing Paul talking to a man on a park bench. The man's face was clearly visible. "So I recognize this man?" Moreau asked. Thomas examined the photo, his eyes widening. "Yes. It's Victor Larson, the CEO of Corporation X." Moreau nodded, satisfied. "Exactly. This photo was taken exactly on the day and location Sophie mentioned. Your memory provided us the connection we needed." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Paul Durand was being confronted with the evidence gathered against him. Sitting in an interrogation room, he looked at his trembling hands, knowing there was nowhere left to run. With a sigh, he began to speak. "It started about a year ago," Paul confessed, his voice breaking. "Phi Corporation X approached me with a proposal. They wanted inside information on Thomas's operations. At first, it was small things, harmless. But then," he paused, tears brimming in his eyes. "They started asking for more. They wanted me to sabotage deals, manipulate data. I didn't want to, but they had information on some questionable transactions I had made in the past. They threatened to expose me if I didn't cooperate." The investigator leaned forward. "And the fire? How does that fit in?" Paul swallowed hard. "It was their idea. They said it was the final move to destroy Thomas. I was supposed to increase the insurance and plant evidence incriminating him. I didn't know they would actually set the building on fire. I thought it was just a threat to force Thomas to sell." As Paul continued his confession, detailing each step of the conspiracy, chaos erupted at the Corporation X headquarters. Employees ran from one side to the other, shredding documents and deleting electronic records. In the midst of the confusion, Victor Larson, the CEO, tried to maintain calm. "We need to contain this," he shouted to his advisors. "Deny everything. Blame Paul if necessary." But it was too late. The authorities were already on their way, armed with warrants for search and seizure. In a moment of panic, Larson made a desperate decision. He grabbed a briefcase full of money and important documents and ran to the underground parking lot. Unfortunately for Larson, the police had anticipated such a move. When he accelerated his sports car towards the exit, he was met by a barrier of police vehicles. "Victor Larson," Moreau's amplified voice echoed, "you're surrounded. Turn off the vehicle and step out with your hands up." The image of the powerful CEO being handcuffed and placed in a police car was quickly captured by journalists who had gathered at the scene. In a matter of minutes, the news spread like wildfire. Back at the police station, Thomas watched the news with a mix of relief and incredulity. His nightmare was finally coming to an end. "Mr. Thomas," Moreau said, entering the room, "I think we have good news for you. With Paul's confession and the evidence against Corporation X, it's clear you were a victim of an elaborate conspiracy. All charges against you will be dropped." Thomas felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. "And I don't know how to thank you, Detective, for not giving up on finding the truth." Moreau smiled. "Actually, you should thank your young friend, Sophie. Without her observations, we might never have made the crucial connection." Thomas laughed, tears of relief brimming in his eyes. "Sophie. That girl is truly amazing." As Thomas left the police station, he was met by a crowd of reporters. Flashes went off and questions were shouted, but all he wanted was to see one person. As if answering his silent wish, he saw a familiar face standing out in the crowd. Sophie, accompanied by her parents, ran towards him. "Mr. Thomas!" she cried, throwing herself into his arms. Thomas knelt down, hugging her tightly. "Sophie! Oh, Sophie, you have no idea how much you've helped me." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with happiness. "I told you the good guys always win in the end, didn't I?" Thomas laughed, feeling a wave of gratitude and affection for this extraordinary child who had become his savior. As he stood up, he saw Anne and Pierre approaching, their expressions a mix of caution and admiration. "Thomas," Pierre said, extending his hand, "we think we owe you an apology." Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling a wave of emotion. "There's no need. You were just protecting your daughter, and I will be forever grateful that you allowed our friendship to continue, despite everything." Anne smiled, tears in her eyes. Well, I think we've all learned a valuable lesson about trust and judging too quickly." As the group left the police station together, Thomas knew his life would never be the same again. The conspiracy had been unraveled, his innocence proven, but the true treasure he had found in this journey was the pure and unbreakable friendship of a brave 9-year-old girl. The future, once so uncertain, now shone with possibilities. Thomas knew that, with Sophie by his side, he could face any challenge that came his way, and together they would continue to make the world a little better, one act of kindness at a time. The sun shone brightly over the city, as if celebrating the triumph of truth. In front of the courthouse, a crowd gathered to witness a historic moment. Reporters jostled, cameras rolling incessantly, capturing every detail of what was about to become one of the biggest corporate scandals of the decade. Victor Larson, CEO of Corporation X, and Paul Durand, former right-hand man of Thomas D., were escorted into the building, handcuffed and heads bowed. The charges were severe: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, among others. The fall of the powerful was a spectacle the city wouldn't soon forget. Inside the courtroom, Thomas watched the scene with a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that his innocence had been proven, sadness for the betrayal of people he had once considered friends. The judge, with a solemn voice, declared, "After an extensive investigation and based on the evidence presented, this court declares Thomas completely innocent of all charges. Furthermore, we recognize that he was a victim of an elaborate corporate conspiracy." A murmur of approval ran through the room. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past months finally dissipating. In the days that followed, the city seemed to awake from a collective nightmare. The truth about the Corporation X conspiracy dominated the headlines, and with it came a wave of support for Thomas. People who had once judged him now approached to offer their apologies and solidarity. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, now almost fully renovated, Thomas was surprised by a group of local residents. "Mr. Thomas," an elderly woman said, approaching him timidly, "we wanted to tell you how happy we are that your innocence has been proven, and, well, thank you for not giving up on our park, and even with everything that happened." Thomas smiled, touched by the gesture. "And this park, this community, you've given me a new purpose when I needed it most. I'm the one who should be thanking you." The news of Thomas's innocence and the exposure of the Corporation X conspiracy had a profound impact on the corporate world. Investors and business partners, once hesitant, now rushed to reaffirm their confidence in Thomas and his company. Taking advantage of this moment of renewal, Thomas called a meeting with his entire company team. The auditorium was packed, the atmosphere charged with expectation. "My friends," Thomas began, his voice firm and filled with conviction, "the recent events have shown us how easy it is to lose our way, how dangerous it can be to put profit above ethics. Today, I announce a radical change in our way of doing business." He then detailed a new plan of action: complete transparency in all operations, an independent ethics council, programs for corporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability. The audience listened in respectful silence, many nodding in approval. "It won't be easy," Thomas continued, "but I believe we can be an example of how success in business and moral integrity are not mutually exclusive." The reaction was overwhelming. Applause echoed through the auditorium, some employees even standing up in a standing ovation. Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was the legacy he wanted to leave. Amidst all this transformation, there was one person Thomas couldn't forget: Sophie, the little hero whose friendship and perspicacity had been fundamental in uncovering the truth. One afternoon, Thomas invited Sophie and her parents for a special tour of the renovated park. As they walked, he couldn't help but notice the gleam of pride in the girl's eyes as she saw all the improvements. "Sophie," Thomas said, kneeling down to be at her eye level, "you know you were crucial in helping us discover the truth, right?" Sophie blushed, shaking her head modestly. "I just told what I saw, Mr. Thomas, and that's exactly what made the difference," he smiled. "Your honesty, your friendship, you've taught me more than any business book ever could." Anne and Pierre watched the scene, deeply moved. They had learned a valuable lesson about not judging by appearances and about the power of true friendship. Finally, the big day arrived, the inauguration of the new park wing. A crowd gathered, eager to see the final result of the project that had captured the city's imagination. Thomas stepped onto the small stage set up for the occasion, Sophie by his side. He looked out at the audience, seeing familiar faces and new ones, all united by the promise of a better future. "To us friends," Thomas began, his voice filled with emotion, "this park is more than just a green space in our city. It's a symbol of resilience, of community, and above all, of friendship." He paused, placing his hand on Sophie's shoulder. "A few months ago, I was a man focused only on numbers and profits. Then I met this extraordinary young girl. Sophie taught me to see the world with new eyes, to rediscover the importance of honesty and compassion. The audience listened in respectful silence, many with tears in their eyes. It was the friendship of this child that not only changed my life, but also helped expose and correct injustices in the corporate world. She reminded me that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources. Thomas then turned to Sophie, smiling. It's why I have the pleasure of announcing that this new wing of the park will be named Friendship and Courage Square, in honor of Sophie and all the children who remind us daily of the importance of being better. The crowd erupted in applause. Sophie, with wide eyes of surprise and joy, hugged Thomas tightly. As the public dispersed to explore the new area, Thomas stood back, watching the scene with a satisfied smile. Anne and Pierre approached, their expressions a mix of gratitude and admiration. "Thomas," Pierre said, extending his hand, "thank you. Not just for what you've done for the park and the community, but for being such a wonderful friend to our daughter." Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling a wave of emotion. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. Your daughter. She's changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the renovated park, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey he had lived, from accused to redeemer, from cold businessman to compassionate philanthropist. And all thanks to the unlikely friendship of a brave 9-year-old girl. The future, once so uncertain, now shone with possibilities. Thomas knew that, with friends like Sophie by his side, he could face any challenge that came his way. And together, they would continue to make the world a little better, one act of kindness at a time. As he walked away from the park, hand in hand with Sophie, Thomas felt a sense of peace and purpose he had never known before. The road ahead was uncertain, but with such a brave and wise friend by his side, he knew he could face whatever came his way. And so, with the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city, Thomas and Sophie stepped into the future, ready to face whatever adventures awaited them, together. The sun shone brightly over the city, as if celebrating the triumph of truth. In front of the courthouse, a crowd gathered to witness a historic moment. Reporters jostled, cameras rolling incessantly, capturing every detail of what was about to become one of the biggest corporate scandals of the decade. Victor Larson, CEO of Corporation X, and Paul Durand, former right-hand man of Thomas, were escorted into the building, handcuffed and heads bowed. The charges were severe: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, among others. The fall of the powerful was a spectacle the city wouldn't soon forget. Inside the courtroom, Thomas watched the scene with a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that his innocence had been proven, sadness for the betrayal of people he had once considered friends. The judge, with a solemn voice, declared, "After an extensive investigation and based on the evidence presented, this court declares Thomas completely innocent of all charges. Furthermore, we recognize that he was a victim of an elaborate corporate conspiracy." A murmur of approval ran through the room. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past months finally dissipating. In the days that followed, the city seemed to awake from a collective nightmare. The truth about the Corporation X conspiracy dominated the headlines, and with it came a wave of support for Thomas. People who had once judged him now approached to offer their apologies and solidarity. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, now almost fully renovated, Thomas was surprised by a group of local residents. "Mr. Thomas," an elderly woman said, approaching him timidly, "we wanted to tell you how happy we are that your innocence has been proven, and, well, thank you for not giving up on our park, and even with everything that happened." Thomas smiled, touched by the gesture. "And this park, this community, you've given me a new purpose when I needed it most. I'm the one who should be thanking you." The news of Thomas's innocence and the exposure of the Corporation X conspiracy had a profound impact on the corporate world. Investors and business partners, once hesitant, now rushed to reaffirm their confidence in Thomas and his company. Taking advantage of this moment of renewal, Thomas called a meeting with his entire company team. The auditorium was packed, the atmosphere charged with expectation. "My friends," Thomas began, his voice firm and filled with conviction. "The recent events have shown us how easy it is to lose our way, how dangerous it can be to put profit above ethics. Today, I announce a radical change in our way of doing business." He then detailed a new plan of action: complete transparency in all operations, an independent ethics council, programs for corporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability. The audience listened in respectful silence, many nodding in approval. "It won't be easy," Thomas continued, "but I believe we can be an example of how success in business and moral integrity are not mutually exclusive." The reaction was overwhelming. Applause echoed through the auditorium, some employees even standing up in a standing ovation. Thomas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was the legacy he wanted to leave. Amidst all this transformation, there was one person Thomas couldn't forget: Sophie, the little hero whose friendship and perspicacity had been fundamental in uncovering the truth. One afternoon, Thomas invited Sophie and her parents for a special tour of the renovated park. As they walked, he couldn't help but notice the gleam of pride in the girl's eyes as she saw all the improvements. "Sophie," Thomas said, kneeling down to be at her eye level, "you know you were crucial in helping us discover the truth, right?" Sophie blushed, shaking her head modestly. "I just told what I saw, Mr. Thomas, and that's exactly what made the difference," he smiled. "Your honesty, your friendship, you've taught me more than any business book ever could." Anne and Pierre watched the scene, deeply moved. They had learned a valuable lesson about not judging by appearances and about the power of true friendship. Finally, the big day arrived, the inauguration of the new park wing. A crowd gathered, eager to see the final result of the project that had captured the city's imagination. Thomas stepped onto the small stage set up for the occasion, Sophie by his side. He looked out at the audience, seeing familiar faces and new ones, all united by the promise of a better future. "To us friends," Thomas began, his voice filled with emotion, "this park is more than just a green space in our city. It's a symbol of resilience, of community, and above all, of friendship." He paused, placing his hand on Sophie's shoulder. "A few months ago, I was a man focused only on numbers and profits. Then I met this extraordinary young girl. Sophie taught me to see the world with new eyes, to rediscover the importance of honesty and compassion." The audience listened in respectful silence, many with tears in their eyes. "It was the friendship of this child that not only changed my life, but also helped expose and correct injustices in the corporate world. She reminded me that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources." Thomas then turned to Sophie, smiling. "It's why I have the pleasure of announcing that this new wing of the park will be named Friendship and Courage Square, in honor of Sophie and all the children who remind us daily of the importance of being better." The crowd erupted in applause. Sophie, with wide eyes of surprise and joy, hugged Thomas tightly. As the public dispersed to explore the new area, Thomas stood back, watching the scene with a satisfied smile. Anne and Pierre approached, their expressions a mix of gratitude and admiration. "Thomas," Pierre said, extending his hand, "thank you. Not just for what you've done for the park and the community, but for being such a wonderful friend to our daughter." Thomas shook the offered hand, feeling a wave of emotion. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. Your daughter. She's changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the renovated park, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey he had lived, from accused to redeemer, from cold businessman to compassionate philanthropist, and all thanks to the unlikely friendship